and I want to welcome everyone here tonight. Thank you for joining us. This is an exciting topic, obviously. Lots of people are interested in tomatoes, so we're excited to be sharing some information with you. And I'm going to thank our hosts as well, which is Napa County Library. And I'm turning over to Stefana Premick from the Napa Library to make some comments, to welcome you.
Hi, Yvonne. Thank you for being with us tonight. We have tomato fever also. My husband picked this up today from the Master Gardener's sale, and he's very excited. He's kind of driving me a little bit crazy about it because, you know, he loves his tomatoes and he can hardly wait to put it in the ground. I invite you to come to the library to take a look at our home and garden section. We do have many books on growing vegetables and fruits and the care of the garden. And today I have one book called Epic Tomatoes, How to Select and Grow the Best Varieties of All Time. And it's a book by Craig Le-Houlier. And in it, it has some beautiful, beautiful illustrations and actually photographed beautiful images of tomatoes. Look at those. Don't they look scrumptious? And there is a lot of information here that tells you about the care of tomatoes. You know, there's even a few recipes on what to do with some of those tomatoes once they have grown and you've picked them and you've got bushels of fruit. So I encourage you again to come to the library. And now I turn it over to our presenters.
Thanks, Stefana. And I am really glad to turn it over to our speakers tonight. And that's going to be Jane. So go ahead, Jane, and I will mute myself.
Thank you. Thank you, Yvonne and Stefana. And welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining. We really appreciate you taking time out of your Thursday evenings to join our library talk. As you know, we're the Master Gardeners of Napa County, and you may be familiar with our mission, but just to make sure, I'll let you know that our goal and our mission is to extend research-based knowledge and information on home horticulture, pest management, and sustainable landscape practices to the residents of California and Napa County in particular. So what we're going to talk about tonight is we'll talk about containers, and we'll also talk about some things to know and consider when you're thinking about growing tomatoes in containers. And then we will talk tomatoes. That's the start of the evening. And when we finish, we'd like to turn the table and hear about your experience growing tomatoes in containers. As Yvonne mentioned, as we go along, if you have some questions, please put them in the chat. But we also, as I said tonight, after we covered the questions that were entered into the chat, we're going to open the mic, and we'd like to hear about some of your experiences growing tomatoes in containers. And be sure to share not just maybe your favorite tomato to grow in a container, but also some of your successes and failures. So again, it's not moving.
Take your cursor down to the far right or far left, sorry, the bottom far left, and you should be able to find.
Okay, here we go.
There you go.
Okay, so, and for some reason this, I keep seeing people being admitted that I haven't seen before.
That's because you're a co-host, so you're seeing the
okay
coming in.
Okay. So why grow tomatoes in containers? There could be several reasons, but maybe you have limited space. Maybe you live in an apartment or a condominium, and you have limited space where you can plant vegetables or tomatoes. Or maybe even you live, for example, I live in an area, I have a swimming pool, and so I have a fair amount of concrete in the backyard. And the space that I do have for gardening, I also like to grow ornamentals. So I'm limited on where I can put some vegetables that require a fair amount of sun. Or maybe you have poor soil or no soil. Poor soil can be perhaps, and we'll talk about this tonight as well, is you may need to be rotating some crops Maybe the soil that you have is not the best right now this year for a tomato. Or again, you may be limited on any soil that's available to you. Or you could be limited on sun due to trees, shade, and other structures nearby. Maybe you have to kind of chase the sun to get the maximum amount of hours for your tomatoes. And so you need to move your container from place to place. And I say, why not? Many gardeners have great success growing tomatoes in containers. And I assume there's members of the audience tonight that have had that success and would sure like to hear about your success.
Especially if they might be the.
So growing plants in containers is nothing new. It's actually been around for a long, long time. Plant containers date back to Egyptians, and they were once the earliest civilization. They were one of the earliest civilizations to use plant containers as a way of moving plants from one growing area to another. Gardens were an important source for food, but also provided raw materials for religious offerings, medicinal purposes, and building materials. And pottery depicts various uses for containers, including date palm trade and other fruits. And the Chinese were growing trees in containers in 500 BC. We have ancient Greece to thank for our contemporary gardens. The Minoans and the Mycenaeans, this was a civilization that developed into Greece. The Minoans were known to grow plants in containers, and excavations have found lines of terracotta pots watered by irrigation channels. So it's nothing new to try growing your vegetables in a container. Oops. So does it matter the size of the container? If you're ready to start thinking about planting vegetables or tomato in particular, you need to think about a few things. And if you're not aware of the different growing habits of the tomato, you may choose a tomato simply based on what you like to eat. And knowing the growing habits of the tomato is going to help you choose the best container. People choose small containers sometimes, not realizing that you also need to account for the size of the plant's root system. Choosing the wrong size can really make it difficult on a tomato, which has a big root system. Too small a container, and the plant can not only topple over, but the roots of the plant is going to get bound up and wrapped round and round. And this photo, this is a mint, but this is exactly what can happen to your tomato plant's roots if it's not in a container that is the best for its root system. Because the roots run horizontally to the side of the pot, and then they're forced downward where they grow in a circular pattern, or they stop growing. And this is difficult on a tomato, which actually has a pretty big root system. Tomatoes have a taproot, and tomato roots can grow between 2 to 3 feet. If the roots don't have enough room to grow, it's going to stunt the plant's growth. And tomatoes need water and nutrients, and root health is really key to a healthy tomato plant. So think about the depth of the roots for a mature tomato when choosing the size of your container. A 15 to 20 gallon container or pot is recommended for the standard varieties of tomatoes. And we'll talk more about varieties in just a little bit. So regardless of the container you choose, drainage is also very important. And containers can be made of very different types of materials and various sizes. And apart from the aesthetics, the different materials have their own advantages and disadvantages, including the ability to move it if you need to move that container to get the maximum amount of sun. So let's talk first about non-porous containers. Whoops. Non-porous containers. Non-porous containers don't offer the breathability that a porous container is going to offer. And so they might not be able to support the healthy microorganisms of a porous pot. However, the benefit can be is that they're less expensive and you may have fewer watering demands. Plastic containers are made of plastic are also, they're easier to move around. They also have a greater variety of sizes and colors and shapes. And I've also read, though, that plastic containers can leach toxins when exposed to heat. So you want to be careful about your plastic. Choose plastic material with the numbers 1, 2, 4, or 5. And most nursery plastics are labeled 5. The downside of plastic is it can topple over in high winds. But the major downside for plastic is they land up in our landfills because plastic does not recycle. Another option is the galvanized steel troughs. They're attractive to some. However, when it's hot and they are in direct sun, they can become very hot and harm the plant's roots. They do retain moisture. In fact, you actually need to be a little cautious of not overwatering, and the soil can become compacted in these types of troughs. So you'd want to use amended organic soil, and that would be important. I've also read that it's best to try to drill some extra holes or drainage holes in the galvanized troughs. All containers should have sufficient drainage holes. And if a drainage hole is not there, you can usually use just a household drill to drill a hole. And this photo in the center here is one of our master gardeners, Jane Berger, who does all her tomatoes in containers. And she recycles her plastic containers and sanitizes them, but she's also drilled extra drainage holes to ensure she gets the maximum amount of drainage. So, porous containers. Porous containers allow the potting mix or the soil to breathe because they are porous. It also allows excess water to be drawn out and gets a little more air to the roots. You don't want a hard compacted soil because that's not healthy for the plant. Healthy soil has many microorganisms and they thrive if the soil is not compacted. A porous container is going to allow you the ability to encourage potting soil that kind of replicates healthy soil with tilth and thriving microorganisms. The key with a porous container is regular watering. Examples of porous containers are the fabric pots, the unglazed terracotta, or the wooden. And keep in mind, again, if you're going to have to move these pots, some of them that weigh less may be of benefit to you. Now, these are the fabric pots. Some folks don't like fabric pots because they're not that attractive. But they do prevent the roots from wrapping around and around like we saw in that other photo. The fabric containers offer what is known as air pruning. The air pruning happens naturally when roots are exposed to the absence of to air, to the absence of high humidity. And the roots are effectively burned off, causing the plant to produce new and healthy branching roots versus wrapping around and around in the pot. Plus, fabric bags are light, easy to move, and they're reusable for many years if you're cleaning them after each year, and supposedly they are biodegradable. Another type, some others that are porous containers are the unglazed terracotta pots, and emphasize unglazed. They look attractive, and they offer the porosity that we were just talking about. The downside is that they are heavy and difficult to move around, especially once filled with soil. And lime and mineral salts will build up over a period of time, over a number of years. They're more costly than some of the other porous options, but they last for years in our warm winter climate. Then there is the paper biodegradable pots. And again, they're biodegradable, which is a benefit, and they are light and they offer the porosity that you're looking for. And you're avoiding plastics. Then there's the wooden containers. Wooden containers help to protect the roots and insulate them from high summer temperatures. They offer the breathability, but they don't dry out as fast as a terracotta pot. You want to avoid pressure-treated lumber because of the chemical preservatives. And it can be difficult to move these around once you get the soil in them. And you can't you can't forget a type of container is also a raised bed. And a raised bed is easy to maintain compared to many small pots. It's easier to control water and drainage. You're able to control the soil health a little bit more for a longer period of time. And we'll talk about crop rotation. And in all of these containers, you do need to think about crop rotation and also thinking about new potting soil every few years, especially if you notice plants are not being very vigorous the year before or showing some types of diseases. So raised beds is actually the most efficient of all container options, but the caveat is you have to have the room for them. Okay, this is an example of one of the master gardeners, Rich Bruins, who loves tomatoes. And this year in particular, he grew 26 different varieties. He had over 40 plastic containers that he used for his tomatoes. Some things to note here is these are probably about a 20 gallon, it's probably about a 15-gallon container. Notice he has them raised up off the cement, which is important, not just for drainage, but also keeping the pot from on the hot cement. And he already has his support system in. And there's the success. At mid-July, his plants were very healthy and he had great success and lots of tomatoes. I said, well, what did you do with all those tomatoes? And he said, I traded them for other things. So as you can see, there's a lot of success growing tomatoes in containers. So let's talk about the star of the night, and that's the tomato, Solanum lycopersicum, a plant in the Solanaceae or nightshade family. Tomatoes are one of the most common garden fruits in the United States. And yes, a tomato is a fruit, not a vegetable. They're close cousins of tobacco, chili peppers, potato, and eggplant. They were found as a Central American vine, originally considered poisonous and grown solely for an ornamental value. But nowadays, we have hundreds of varieties that are available to the home gardener. They range widely in size, shape, and color, and plant type. And you'll also hear tomatoes categorized as cherry tomato, plum, globe, beefsteak, oxheart. Sometimes you'll see it referred to as this is a good slicing tomato, a paste, or a sauce. So as you can see, choosing the best one can be difficult. And I think everyone has one or two favorites. You can plant any variety in a container, but the best for containers may be a variety that is more compact. But it depends on your particular situation. If you live in an apartment or a condo or have limited space, you may find a compact dwarf or micro dwarf best suited for your needs. So the dwarf and micro dwarf, these are tomatoes. They're very popular, becoming more and more popular for containers and hanging baskets, garden or patio locations. And they have been bred specifically for small spaces. Interestingly, the plant is created to be dwarf, but not necessarily the tomato. And there are many cultivars within the dwarf category. And some of these cultivars are the result of a community of volunteer hobbyists and gardeners worldwide who have been growing low maintenance tomatoes for small spaces over 10 years. And these are some of the, just a few of the many cultivars within the dwarf or micro dwarf, the Tiny Tim, Cherry Gold, Red Robin, and Yellow Canary. And the dwarf tomatoes or patio tomatoes can be grown in anywhere as a 5-gallon or 10-gallon container, or even a hanging basket. So what are some things you should look for when you're ready to purchase your tomato? Some things we'll talk about are a few items to consider, the determinate versus indeterminate, disease resistance, heirloom versus hybrid, days to maturity, and climate needs. So let's first talk about determinate versus indeterminate. You may hear this, oh, this is a determinate tomato. Determinate is the description of the growth habit. It indicates the tomato will grow to a certain size and produce most or all of the fruit within a short period of time. And you may also hear this sometimes referred to as a bush tomato. And often hear that determinate tomatoes are best suited for containers because of this growth habit. It's also a considerate for you if you're thinking of canning or making sauce or paste. And that's because you're going to get all your tomatoes around a set period of time. If you look at this slide, it shows you that a determinate tomato is basically self-topping. The terminal buds on the top there are going to set fruit and stop stem growth on all the blooms, and the fruit develop on the plant at the same time. And then it's going to decline in vigor. Thus, it has a short harvest window. So if you're looking for a time that I want all my tomatoes in at a certain point, you may consider a determinate tomato. Determinate tomatoes get to be about 3 to 5 feet in height. A tomato with an indeterminate growth pattern, the growth, it's just going to continue nonstop to grow. It's going to continue to grow until the first frost, or it just doesn't have enough sunlight to sustain it. The plant produce and grow all summer long. And as you'll see in the slide, an indeterminate tomato is going to produce, continue to produce leaves and more stem from the growing tip indefinitely. Indeterminate tomatoes can get to be about 6 feet in height and will definitely need caged. So why might it matter? Why might you want to know whether it's a determinate or indeterminate? Well, it depends on where you're growing the tomato. I've grown both determinate and indeterminate tomatoes in containers. I personally use the smart pots in my garden. However, if I was confined to an apartment balcony, I might choose a determinate tomato, or if I wanted to make sure that I have all my tomatoes finished by late August or early September, because I want to do some canning. There's some really delicious, both determinate and indeterminate tomatoes. My experience with growing tomatoes in containers is not restricted to the compact bush types. We've tried numerous varieties each year. Some of our standards, the ones that my husband and I love, are the Sweet 100, the Sun Gold, and Early Girl. And then each year, of course, we're always enticed by a few more varieties. So you may also see that tomatoes have been bred for disease resistance. So when choosing a tomato to grow, you may see something such as FV, and that's an indicator that this particular plant has been bred to resist a specific type of disease. Fusarium wilt is the F, and it's caused by a soil-borne fungus, Fusarium oxysporum, and it infects the roots and stems of tomatoes. The leaves start to yellow and wilt, and sometimes that happens only on one side of the plant. And then the brownish streaks start to creep up the main stem. This is normally fatal to the plant. The best control is to grow resistant varieties. And Fusarium can survive in the soil for a long time, and it spreads easily. It can be spread by shoes or garden tools, etc. So it's something that many varieties have been bred to resist. The other is Fusarium, Verticillium wilt, Verticillium dahlia. And it's similar to the Fusarium wilt, and it actually can be difficult to distinguish the two. The Verticillium wilt affects other plants such as potatoes, peppers, tomatoes, and eggplants. In fact, there's 400 plant species that are affected by Verticillium. And this fungus persists in the soil for a long period as well. And what it does, it interferes with the water transport in the stems. And as I said, it's kind of difficult to tell one from the other. From what I've read, even some strong background horticulturalists sometimes have a difficult time, but it's the way the necrotic and the yellowing takes place on the leaves. Crop rotation is also important for these, for controlling verticillium, wilt, and fusarium. You need to rotate out the susceptible plants for 2 years. The best option, of course, is to grow plants that have been bred to resist. Another indicator that you might see for disease resistance is the T and the N. The T is the tobacco mosaic. It's a mosaic that forms on the leaves and causes this leaf malformation. As we shared earlier, tomatoes have cousins in the tobacco and potato family, and they are also susceptible to this virus. There are many sources of the tobacco mosaic virus, including tobacco products, and it also can be easily transmitted by infected plant parts, equipment, and seed. And actually, even smokers can transmit and infect a plant just by handling it. It can survive in plant debris for a number of years. So again, looking for a plant that might be disease resistant to tobacco mosaic is important. And then these little lovelies over here, root knot nematodes. And now there's beneficial nematodes, and then there's some not so beneficial nematodes. And the root knot nematode is a microscopic eelworm which lives in the soil. And they feed on the small roots and cause them to form these galls that you see here. The damaged roots then can't absorb the water properly, so the plants wilt during warm weather. Crop rotation is one of the options for controlling root knot nematodes. And that's one of the benefits of container gardening for all of these diseases we've talked about, is the ability to empty your container at the end of the season, sanitize it, and then, of course, looking for disease resistance. So some other things you'll hear about a tomato is it heirloom or is it hybrid? Hybrid it's in a plant that has been intentionally cross-pollinated between 2 specific plants of 2 distinct crop varieties. And the result is the child plant with characteristics of both the parent plant, that 3rd variety. And often the result or the purpose is to create a plant that's hardier, possibly disease resistant, or a tomato that can be consistent in size and shape and taste. You can't save the seeds from a hybrid and replant a hybrid seed as you can in heirloom, because you're not going to get a plant that is true to type, and it may not be similar to the parent. An heirloom tomato, as on the other hand, is open pollinated. Its plants have been produced by seeds, a result of natural pollination of the parent plant. And they are supposed to have been documented to have been in cultivation for at least 50 years. And the downside might be they may not necessarily lack disease resistance. And actually, a lot of people say, heirloom is much tastier than a hybrid. I personally haven't found that to be the case, and I think it's just a matter of taste. Some others that you may see to look for is days to maturity. That's the number of days from transplant to the first picking of fruit. And here I'll state that depends. There's always variables, as you've known, in gardening. That what's happening on the date of the transplant, what's the weather conditions. If, for example, you transplant the plant into the garden, into your pot, and the soil is cold, or we're still having cold nights, that plant's just going to sit there and it's not really going to put on any growth or begin to fruit. So days to maturity is kind of a relative term, but if you'll see tomatoes that are stated, this is an early season tomato, mid-season or late season, that's going to give you a pretty good idea of when you might be able to be first picking fruit. Tomatoes are bred, as you can see, for many things, not just taste and size and color and so forth, but they're also bred for climate. They are warm season plant. but they can be grown in cooler climates, especially if they're bred for that. You'll see these zones in California, Zone A, and that's, in this case, it's the Napa and Sonoma area. Other areas where the daytime temperatures are usually warm, but generally stay below 95 degrees. And then the Zone B is the inland valleys, and this is where daytime temperatures regularly stay or exceed 95 degrees. And then Zone C is other areas with cool to moderate summers. That could be areas like Eureka, San Francisco, Monterey. It may even come into play if you're in the Carneros area and you have much cooler than other areas of Napa. We were asked last month at our library talk, our topic was on putting vegetables to the test. And somebody in the audience asked if we were familiar with Jersey tomatoes. Have we ever planted Jersey tomatoes? And none of us were familiar with it. So I looked up Jersey tomatoes. It's actually a hybrid bred at Rutgers University, and it's specific to the climate of the East Coast where they have humid summers and they get summer rain. It most likely would not have the same growth habits or growth pattern if you grew it here in California, and it may not have the same acid sweetness flavor that it would have if it was grown in the climate it was bred for. And Rich Bruins, the master gardener, I showed you his pictures earlier of his many varieties that he grows in containers, shared a story that he really wanted to get hold of an Acme tomato. And the Acme tomato was bred for the Campbell Soup Company, and it was bred for a certain type of flavor. So Rich got hold of the seeds and he was able to plant an Acme tomato. But he said the whole summer, the plant never put on fruit. It just was not bred for the climate of California. So climate does make a difference. Okay, we're going to start talking now about planting. But before I do, I just want to have a few comments about soil. You don't want to use soil from your garden because when you're using containers for gardening, it's just not going to have the same aeration and water holding characteristics as good potting soil. So you just don't want to just dig up soil from other parts of your garden and put it in a container. You also want to avoid soil with fertilizers pre-mixed. We'll talk about fertilizing in just a little bit, but generally speaking, tomatoes just do well with a generous application of compost mixed into the soil. Potting soils that contain pre-mixed fertilizers could actually give you too much nitrogen. And if you have too much nitrogen with a tomato plant, you're going to have a lot of green growth, but you may not have fruit or as much fruit. So you don't want to over fertilize with nitrogen. So a good thing to keep in mind is a container mixed by, you want to make your soil a potting mix by combining equal parts of good potting soil with compost, organic matter, perlite, and vermiculite. I personally also add some worm castings to the potting mix. And some master gardeners that I've spoken to have various recipes that they use as well. Some say they use a handful of azomite, which is a volcanic substance, Epsom salts, fish bone meal, crown oyster shells, and some I've talked to also use a worm cast tea. In other words, I think some of us gardeners have a tendency to use quite a range of things for our potting soil. But as we talked about, generally tomatoes do well with just a nice rich soil of compost and potting soil. So ready to plant. You want to plant after the danger of frost. And in the Napa Valley, there's a 50% probability of frost until late February. And this year, I think, was a definite there. As you can recall, we had about 4 or 5 nights of 20-degree temperatures. There's only a 10% chance of frost until early April. But historically, we can have frost as late as June. The nighttime temperatures should be in the 50s when you're ready to plant. You want to locate your container where the tomato is going to receive 8 to 10 hours of direct sun daily. Once full of soil, that container can be heavy and may require you use something like a furniture dolly or a plant dolly. And by the way, if you're going to be doing a fair amount of container gardening, a plant dolly is a good tool to have at your ready, because you may need to move that around. Raise the container off the cement with a plant trivet or a wood pallet. Do not put a layer of gravel or other materials in the bottom of your pot. Adding material to the bottom of a pot is actually going to make drainage worse. If you're worried about maybe soil coming out of the bottom of the pot, maybe too much soil, what you can do is just get take a screen and cut a little round piece of screen and put it at the bottom of the pot. You want to make sure you have good drainage though. Your transplant is ready to plant when it has at least 4 to 6 healthy green true leaves. And generally it should be about 6 to 8 inches tall and hardened to the outdoor temperatures or outdoor conditions. And by hardened off, what we mean is you have slowly acclimated that plant to direct sun and the outdoor conditions, because consider the fact that these plants are coming from a greenhouse and they haven't been exposed to the big wide world. So you want to start acclimating them a little at a time. About 1 to 2 hours before you're ready to plant, you want to water the plant thoroughly. It's recommended that you plant in the late afternoon to minimize water loss during the cooler overnight hours. And you want to ease the plant slowly out of the container and gently be gentle with the roots. You want to avoid handling this main stem, because those little furry things that you see, those little hairs, those are actually roots and can grow. And you can see by this demonstration over here, if you have a tall, lanky tomato plant that you want to transplant, what you can do is take off all the leaves but the top ones, and then gently set it in at a horizontal, and that all of those little fine hairs are going to be roots, and the plant will go upright. And that will give you a nice hardy plant. You then press the soil firmly around the plant so that a slight depression is formed for water holding, and then water thoroughly, and voila, you have your new tomato in its summer home. We talked a little bit about support before, but you want to make sure your plants have some type of support. Tomatoes need a strong support, something such as stakes, cages, or a trellis that can keep the plants upright. Plus, it makes it easier for harvest and also saves space. Even dwarf tomatoes need some type of support. Waiting too long to stake or cage a tomato is risky. You want to stake or cage the plant at planting time before it grows too big. For an indeterminate tomato, for sure, you're going to need to provide good support, because as I mentioned, they can grow to 6 feet tall. It may feel like an extra step now while you're planting, but you'll be happier in the long run that you got it caged, because it's just going to allow the plant, remember they're a vine, and they're just going to grow up the plant up the cage. And they also can help, if it's caged correctly, can also help prevent the tomato itself from getting sun scald. Also, they have found that plants that are caged are less prone to disease than plants that are uncaged. Okay, just some basic care reminders. Tomatoes produce best when the temperature is between 55 and 90. If it's too cold, it's going to the blossoms are going to drop or tend to fall off. If it's 100 degrees, the flowers will not set. So 80 to 90 degrees is kind of the tomato's optimum temperature for growth. 50 to 55 is optimum for the night temperatures for fruit to set. Anything like a 45-degree evening, or you're not going to see the plant growing very fast. Plants will grow slowly. As I mentioned, they need about 8 to 10 hours of direct sun daily. 6 is minimum. And for water, consistent and watering, you want to avoid water fluctuations in the soil moisture. And you also want to avoid overhead water. You don't want to wet the foliage or the fruit with overhead watering. If you don't maintain consistent soil moisture, your chance of fruit cracking and what is called blossom end rot, which we'll talk about in just a minute, can increase. So drip irrigation is very good for a tomato. And this is an example just using drip irrigation in a container. It offers you that ability to have consistency and avoid soil moisture fluctuation. The requirements can vary, of course, in our area, because sometimes we get those really hot days with really hot winds. So you have to be prepared to sometimes just stick your finger in the soil and test it to see if it needs water immediately. And if you put your finger in the soil down to about 1 inch and it still feels moist, there's probably no need for immediate water. And also keep in mind that container gardening, it's going to dry out a little faster than plants that are in the soil. Fertilizing, you want to hold fertilizer until flowering and fruit set. And as I mentioned, you want to avoid excess nitrogen. The nitrogens during the initial growth period is going to offer you lush green vegetative growth, but will delay flowering and fruit set. When planting tomatoes or plants in a container, keep in mind that with each watering, you can be leaching out some nutrients. So consider using a slow release fertilizer or apply a soluble fertilizer every 2 weeks. I use a fertilizer that is specific for vegetables and tomatoes. It's a 4-5-3, 4 nitrogen, 5 is the phosphorus, and 3 is the potash. And it also has a little calcium in it, and calcium is important for tomatoes. Mulch is very important. We highly recommend it. Reduces soil moisture fluctuations, which is important. It helps moderate the soil temperatures, excuse me, and it discourages weeds. And yes, you can get weeds even in a container garden. Don't mulch when you first plant, because plants need that warmth from the sun to the roots to encourage growth. Wait until the first hot weather and then mulch. And then you may have heard pruning tomatoes, the debate whether to prune or not to prune. I personally don't prune tomatoes, but I've read and heard that many gardeners do prune. Commercial growers advocate pruning to increase yield. However, the UC publication for home gardening states, removing suckers will not increase yield, and severe pruning can actually decrease yield and increase sun scald. So it's not necessarily recommended by the UC. I think what a lot of people do for pruning is to help tidy up the plant. If it's a very an indeterminate tomato and it's really taking up the cage, and they're concerned that maybe the tomatoes are not getting enough sun, they may start to prune. And if you are going to prune, you want to pinch off the small side shoots before, of course, they get too long. And so it's just going to help reduce overcrowding in the cage. And just a reminder of some tomato disorders you may see, and these are abiotic. And these are some of the ones that we get calls at the Master Gardener Help Desk. And so just cover a few of these. Blossom end rot. And this is when the just green or ripe fruit gets this, fruit is black and brown at the bottom on the blossom end. And this is normally an indicator that calcium and water are out of balance in the plant. And it can be aggravated by fluctuating soil moistures or excessive nitrogen fertilizer. And this is a physiological disease. It's not a pest. So maintaining even soil moisture is important. Another one is cat facing. And cat facing is this concentric cracks around the stem end, and cracks radiating out from the stem, a malformation and cracking at the blossom end. Again, this is water, wide fluctuations in soil moisture, maybe a wide difference in daytime and nighttime temperatures, or maybe it's gone through a period of fast growth with high temperatures and high soil moisture. So again, as you can see, maintaining consistent soil moisture is important. And you also want to make sure you have good leaf cover as well, especially during hot days. And mulch is going to help here to help you maintain a consistent soil moisture. And then this one is older leaves. All of a sudden you have some older leaves suddenly looking leathery and becoming brittle and stiff. This is a high light intensity and high soil moisture, particularly plants that might be heavily pruned. Some varieties are also more susceptible to this. Guess what the control is? Even soil moisture. And also if we're having one of those really hot, windy days, you want to make sure that the plant might need some protection during those hot days, hottest time of the day. And then this is a one we've talked a little bit about already. This is the blossoms fall off or the plants fail to set fruit. This is normally nighttime temperatures, could be too low. Or, as I mentioned earlier, daytime temperatures are too high. 100-degree temperatures, something above 90 degrees might be, for that type of tomato, might not work. Too much nitrogen can also cause this. Maybe plants set out too early in the spring, or maybe it's just a variety that's not best for our climate. As I mentioned earlier, the Acme tomato is an example of that. So if you have any issues with your tomatoes, tomato disorders, have any concerns about their growth habit, don't hesitate to call the Master Gardener Help Desk, and we'll be help you diagnose. It benefits to send us a picture to have us so we can see what's actually going on as well. And on our website, the gardening resources on our Master Gardener website is really helpful also. And guess what? Yay, we're ready to harvest. Harvesting normally is between the window of July and October, depending on the variety. The key to harvesting the most flavorful tomato is us being patient and waiting. You want to wait until they're fully ripened on the plant. The tomatoes that are picked too early, yes, they can mature on the countertop, but they're just not going to have the same flavor or nutrients. And you'll know the fruit on your plant is ready to pick when it's fully red or yellow or orange or green for some of the unusual varieties, depending on that variety. Once picked, the flavor will be best if the tomatoes are stored at room temperature and eaten pretty quickly. Some tomato, you can put the tomatoes in the refrigerator, but what you can find with tomatoes that have been refrigerated is they get a little mealy. The texture is a little different and they're just not as flavorful. And of course, the nutrients has dissipated. So that's our talk. This is some of the references. These are the references I used for tonight's presentation. And you can find these references and access to our numerous talks and workshops on our website, the UC Master Gardeners of Napa County, and Napa MG UCANR EDU. And we've tried to show this every time, but the way to find that is our website and events find us. And then once you click there, you're going to go down to the references, slides, and workshops and events. So this is a big time of year for the Master Gardeners in Napa County because we're having our annual tomato sale. The sale started with an online option on this past Sunday, and that actually sold out. And now we are having our in-person sale this Saturday at on the April 9th. It starts at 10 o'clock and it says 1 p.m., but the caveat there is until sold out. And that is at 1710 Saskell Avenue. That's next to Central Valley there off of Saskell. Hope you can make it. So now let's talk your experience with tomatoes, and we'll answer some of your questions in the chat.
So let's start with the chat questions first.
Okay, thanks.
I don't know if you already looked at those, Jane.
Oops, that was when I couldn't see the screen. No
Okay.
survey. Okay.
So I can read them off to you if you can't see the screen.
Okay. Okay.
So Melissa is asking, she's asking about fabric pots called a root pouch. They're made from recycled plastic bottles. They have handles. They're easy to move around. She doesn't know if there's any issues with leaching, and she's concerned about that.
Mm-hmm. I'm personally not familiar with that. I guess I would be concerned about the porosity as well as the possible leaching. If there's any indicator on it, whether it's a 1, 2, 4, or 5, that's what I would look for. You can always call the company and ask them as well.
It sounds like it's maybe a woven product, and I'm thinking it's perhaps made from plastic bottles, but yeah, you might just ask the company. They should have information on that. Do containers, as container growing gardeners experience reduced tomato disease problems like verticillium fusarium and early or late blight? That's from Stefna.
I think that one of the benefits of the container gardening is that you can reduce it because you can rotate, you can remove the soil at the end of the season, which is what I do. You reuse the soil in another part of your garden and then sanitize the pot.
Yeah, if you're using new fresh potting soil, you eliminate a lot of those problems. So that's true. Let's see, unfortunately I have to go. Somebody had to leave us. So they were asking about, they will like to see the video later because they have to step out. Let's see, it says, we already planted our tomatoes. Anything we can do to protect from frost? I doubt we're going to get frost, but it is going to get a little cold. They're pretty hardy and tall already. They're about 1 foot tall. So Emily's asking about frost protection at this point in the season.
I keep my fingers crossed. I guess it also depends on the size of the tomato. If you could protect it in some way, you'd have to maybe use PVC, and you don't want it touching the plant.
Right. I was going to say, if they're in the ground versus if they're in a container might make a difference. If they're in a container, you might be able to move them to a slightly sheltered spot. If they're in the ground, I think a little bit of row cover or something like that would probably give you a couple of degrees of warmth, just to kind of, like you said, put some sticks around it so it supports it and doesn't touch the plant. Yeah, let's see, there's a thank you here from a Marin Master Gardener. Recommendations for drip irrigation scheduling for first-time tomato growers. We have 3 plants in a raised bed, 1 grape, 1 globe, and 1 beefsteak. I'm not sure what a globe is, but I know what a grape is. A grape tomato, that is. So it sounds like 2 large tomatoes and then a smaller one. They have 3 plants. They want to know about recommendations for scheduling irrigation. How much, how often?
Yeah. Again, I would, you might be the better one to answer this one, Yvonne, on the drip piece of it, but it depends on the weather that we're having, but trying to keep the soil moist is the key. You don't want it over moist. And so, like I said, sometimes just sticking your finger in it on a daily basis is going to help you at least determine it. I know when Rich Bruins was talking about how he, on all those 40 some containers that he set it up, he just turned it on. turned on all his irrigation and then watched how long it took for the soil to become the right moist. And then he timed that. And then that's what he did every 3 days. So he set it on a consistent timer.
For containers, you do water a little more often than in the ground because you
Yep.
can't water as deep, of course, because you don't have as much soil. So it does depend on the size of your container. You don't want them to get too dry in between watering. So you do have to kind of keep track of that. And remember, the top of the soil dries, but the bottom of the pot stays moist, and you don't want it to be sitting in water. So you do have to be a little bit careful with your monitoring. I would say certainly for the hottest part of the year, every 3 days might be important depending on how hot the area is where your plants are. I water mine generally about once a week, but they're usually in the ground, so they don't dry out quite as quickly.
Yeah. And that's, again, if we have those days where we have the hot winds as well, low humidity, the transpiration from the leaves is really going to affect it as well.
Stems to get pink yellow. I'm not sure what this comment is, but let's see. How do we use the cages effectively? Should we be tying off any part of the plant, or do the branches just rest on the rings?
Yeah, because it's a vine, they know how to use the cages. I've never had to tie any off. You just start, kind of as it's growing up, making sure that it's moving through the various levels of the cage.
Yeah, sometimes I've had branches that grow out underneath one of the hoop edges. And I sometimes will kind of weave it back over. And then if they're really large tomatoes too, I sometimes kind of hang them over so they have extra support so they don't break.
Yeah. The thing to be careful is that if you're moving it around, if it gets too big before you're starting to move it, you can crack a branch.
I don't know. Somebody's asking about white stems with pink effervescence. I'm not sure what that is. Plant stems get pink and don't grow, and then leaves that look shocked and don't get past an inch. So it sounds like the stems are turning kind of pinkish, and then the leaves are staying small and perhaps not growing. That doesn't sound good.
I haven't come across any of the pink. Yvonne had mentioned earlier this week about something called purple vine, where the tomatoes, the veins within the tomato leaf gets a purple color. But that is actually a phosphorus. It's a mild phosphorus out of control. May need a little more phosphorus. But what I learned is there is also a virus that can hit the tomato. It's called tomato purple leaf disorder. They're doing more research on this. We don't know a whole lot about it yet, but it does appear to be a virus that affects tomatoes. And right now it's not necessarily in our part of the country, but some of the other areas of the country are experiencing it with their tomatoes. So more to learn on that as we hear more about it.
So Holly's asking about planter boxes that have some plastic coverings that cover over the soil. Are there any advantages or disadvantages to this? So it perhaps would help it from evaporating water. I'm not sure.
Plastic boxes using plastic covers.
Planter boxes using plastic coverings that cover the soil area. I know that there was some research done on colored mulches using plastic or reflective mulch around the base of the tomatoes, and that repels some of the insect pests. And I'm not sure what this might be for that, or it might also be just to keep the weeds out or to keep the water in. I'm not sure.
I'm not familiar with it. I haven't seen them, nor when I was doing the research did I read anything about it. Mostly what you're concerned about, again, is the porosity of it and how it's going to affect the soil.
So there's a question from Karen about when to water during the growth period. Is there a point where you want to actually hold off water like close to the harvest time?
this sounds like this argument, that a disagreement, I should say, between my husband and I. And he kept saying, well, there's such a thing as a dry tomato. Well, you can do dry gardening or dry tomatoes if you plant in the ground, but you're not going to have the same capability to do that in a container because containers dry out faster.
So I can say that, yeah, if you do hold back water, what happens to the plant is the plant gets stressed, but you will build up the sugars more in your fruit, but you might stress the plant to the point that it's going to not produce any longer. So if you were growing one of those determinate plants, it's going to be all harvested at the same time, and you held back water as it started to get more mature, the plant is going to look horrible, but it will survive, and the tomatoes will taste quite flavorful because it will really load in the sugar. It'll dehydrate them a little bit, but you are at risk of not getting a further crop because if you stress the plant, it will drop the flowers. So it's kind of a, I know there are some people that do what they call dry growing or dry tomatoes, and they will water them up to a point, and then at a certain point, as they start to mature the fruit, once the fruit's set, you can cut off the water completely. So if we were in a severe drought and you ran out of water, you certainly could stop watering your tomatoes and you will still get a crop. They will ripen even off the vine. If you've ever had that experience, you can take a green one that's not ripe and you sit it on your counter, but it doesn't get as much flavor. So you can keep the plants going with a little bit of water and get good flavored fruit. So that's all the chat questions. Do you want to open it up for
Sure.
we're actually at 8 o'clock. I'm so sorry. Crickets. Okay, well then thank you everybody. We'll see you next time.